You're always calm because life broke you first. There's a stillness that comes after the storm, but not the kind poets write about. It's not peace. It's not acceptance. It's the exhausted silence of a nervous system that learned screaming doesn't change anything. You sit there composed, unshaken by news that would devastate others. And people admire your strength. They call you resilient. They say you're wise beyond your years. But you know the truth. You're not calm because you're enlightened. You're calm because something inside you already died. And what remains has simply stopped expecting mercy from the universe. This isn't a story about healing. This is about what happens when your biology gives up on the illusion of safety, when your brain rewires itself around betrayal, and when the organism you call yourself finally accepts that suffering isn't a bug in the system, but the system itself. Evolution didn't design you to be happy. It designed you to survive. And sometimes survival looks like a person who can't feel anything anymore. Let's talk about what calm really is, stripped of its spiritual packaging and Instagram wisdom. Neurologically speaking, calmness is the absence of perceived threat. Your amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped cluster buried deep in your temporal lobe, acts as your brain's alarm system. When it detects danger, it floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing you to fight or flee. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where biology becomes tragedy. Your amygdala doesn't distinguish between a predator and a phone call from someone who hurt you. It doesn't care if the threat is real or remembered. It just screams. And for years, if you grew up in chaos, if you loved people who weaponized your vulnerability, if you experienced trauma that your child brain couldn't process, your amygdala screamed constantly. You lived in a state of perpetual emergency. Your body burned through its stress hormones like fuel. Your hippocampus, responsible for memory and emotional regulation, literally shrank under the weight of chronic cortisol exposure. You weren't just scared. You were biologically transforming into a creature designed for a hostile world. And then something remarkable and terrible happened. Your brain adapted. It had to, because no organism can maintain that level of alert indefinitely without burning out completely. So your nervous system made a calculation. It down-regulated your threat response. It numbed your emotional reactivity. It taught you that feeling less was the only way to keep functioning. You became calm not because you found inner peace, but because your biology staged a coup against your own sensitivity. The neurons that once fired with urgency now barely whisper. The synapses that connected you to hope and fear alike began to atrophy. You didn't transcend suffering. You just stopped being capable of the kind of emotional range that suffering requires. Do you ever feel like consciousness was never meant to exist? Right, I've felt it too, if you understand. This is where we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the evolutionary nightmare that created us. For billions of years, life was simple. Single-celled organisms floated in primordial seas, responding to stimuli with elegant simplicity. Move toward food. Move away from toxins. No memory. No anticipation. No self-awareness to complicate the transaction. Then something went catastrophically right. Neurons clustered. Networks formed. Somewhere in the Cambrian explosion, sensitivity became a survival advantage. The organisms that could detect threats faster, remember dangers longer, and predict outcomes more accurately outlived their competitors. But there's a dark side to every adaptation. With memory came the ability to relive trauma. With anticipation came anxiety about futures that might never arrive. With self-awareness came the horrifying realization that this temporary arrangement of molecules will one day cease to exist. Consciousness wasn't a gift. It was a biological accident that created the only species capable of understanding its own meaninglessness. And here you are, a descendant of that accident, carrying in your skull the most complex object in the known universe. 3 pounds of tissue that can compose symphonies and contemplate infinity, but that spends most of its energy trying not to remember why it hurts so much to be alive. Your calmness isn't enlightenment. It's what happens when a conscious creature finally understands that consciousness itself is the wound. The literature on psychological trauma tells us about something called learned helplessness, a term coined by psychologist Martin Seligman in the 1960s. In his experiments, dogs were subjected to electric shocks they couldn't escape. Eventually, Even when escape became possible, the dogs didn't try. They had learned that their actions didn't matter. They had internalized futility. The same mechanism exists in humans. When you're hurt repeatedly, when your attempts to protect yourself fail, when the people who should love you become the source of your pain, your brain does the math. It concludes that resistance is pointless, and something shifts. You stop fighting, not because you're weak, but because your nervous system has rewritten its fundamental assumptions about how the world works. This is what people see as calmness. You're not reacting because you've learned that reactions don't change outcomes. You're not upset because your brain has classified upset as wasted energy. You survived by becoming the emotional equivalent of a stone. And now you can't remember what it felt like to be soft. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. The same adaptation that protected you in chaos becomes a prison in peace. You meet someone who genuinely cares, and you can't feel it. You achieve something worth celebrating, and it registers as just another event in a meaningless sequence. Your nervous system, so thoroughly trained in threat detection, can't recognize safety when it finally arrives. You're not choosing to be distant. You're neurologically incapable of vulnerability because vulnerability is what almost destroyed you. The price of survival was the death of the self that could have enjoyed surviving. There's a concept in evolutionary biology called the Red Queen hypothesis, named after the character in Through the Looking Glass who tells Alice, "It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place." In nature, species evolve not to get ahead, but just to avoid extinction. Predators get faster, so prey must get faster. Parasites get better at invading, so immune systems get better at defending. It's an arms race with no winner, only temporary survivors. You are living the psychological version of this. Every time you adapted to pain, life presented new pain that required new adaptation. Every time you built defenses, something found a way through. You've been running your entire life just to stay alive. And what people call your calmness is just the exhaustion of a creature who finally stopped running because there's nowhere left to go. You stand still now, not because you've arrived anywhere, but because motion and stillness feel equally pointless when the race itself is rigged. And maybe that's the closest thing to wisdom that biology can offer. Not the wisdom of understanding, but the wisdom of surrender. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of depletion. So what do we do with this? What does it mean to live as a broken thing that can't be unbroken? The honest answer is there is no redemption arc here. There's no therapeutic technique that will give you back the version of yourself that existed before life taught you who you really are. That person is gone, not metaphorically, neurologically. The neural pathways that sustain that version of you have been pruned, overwritten, reassigned. You are literally not the same organism anymore. But here's the strange beauty in that. If you're not the person you were, you're also not obligated to the story that person believed. You don't have to keep performing resilience for people who mistake your numbness for strength. You don't have to pretend that calmness is the same as okay. You can exist in the wreckage of yourself without calling it a home. You can acknowledge that you're broken without making it your identity. The tragedy isn't that life broke you. The tragedy is that consciousness forces you to witness your own breaking and then asks you to find meaning in it. But maybe the meaning isn't in healing. Maybe it's in the sheer, absurd defiance of continuing to exist despite knowing that existence is suffering, that your calmness is a scar, and that the universe remains indifferent to both. You're calm because you had to be, and you're still here because some irrational cluster of neurons insists on surviving even when survival stopped being worth it. That's not enlightenment. That's biology. And somehow it's the only honest form of courage we have. If you see beauty in the darkness of existence, if these words found something in you that you thought was yours alone, you belong here. Subscribe to this channel. Not because I have answers, but because we're asking the same questions in the dark. And maybe that's enough.